Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and it's part 11 of my Boomsday Project card review. This time around, tons of new legendary cards, lots of cards in total. Don't have a ton of time, so we're going to move through this pretty quickly. That said, if you're looking for a super fast preview of these cards, of course, you can hit the quick reviews link in the description. Otherwise, let's go ahead and jump into the slightly less detailed than normal reviews. So up first here, I have the new Shaman spell, the Stormbringer. Legendary spell for Shaman. It's 7 mana, and it reads, transform your minions into random legendary minions. So this kind of follows that Evolve or Thrall Deathseer sort of line where you're transforming your stuff theoretically into better stuff. The challenge for Stormbringer, of course, is that random legendary minions is a pretty inconsistent transformation mechanic. Unlike Evolve, which is based on a cost basis, or Thrall Deathseer, a cost basis, and on average, minions of higher costs, of course, end up being better than minions of lower cost. There's high rolls and low rolls, certainly, but on average, it works out in your favor. That's not necessarily the case with legendary minions, because a lot of legendaries are very specialized. They're understated with some sort of powerful battle cry or effect, or maybe they are based on synergies, and you can't, of course, exploit those synergies because your deck isn't designed that way. So a lot of legendaries are just not very good to get them randomly. Not counting, of course, the Lorewalker Chose and the Nat Pagels of the world. Those are especially terrible, but those are counterbalanced by the Tyrians and everything else. It's those middle-of-the-road legendaries, the mid-cost stuff, those super specific cards that are all about just building a deck and doing something weird. That's the problem. And to me, that means that Stormbringer is just going to be less consistent than some of those evolve effects we saw in the past. Not to mention, it's also more expensive and it's one-time use. So unlike Thrall Deathseer, which, pays off over time, or unlike Evolve, which there's a couple copies of and is super cheap so you can combo it out in a single turn, the Stormbringer ends up being this card that has all this follow-up potential. But when you do that, it doesn't necessarily help you win the game. It doesn't create some big swing turn necessarily. And you'd be better off with just that Thrall or even a Bloodlust, I think, to help ensure that you're utilizing those minions on board in a really positive game-ending sort of fashion. The Stormbringer is very rarely going to do that. So it's going to be a fun card. It's going to be great when it comes off of free random stuff if it can. And it's going to have some relevance from time to time, and I'm going to try to make it work, of course, like everybody else. But I just don't think this is going to end up being a very consistent, constructed format kind of card, particularly not one that you build around, because it's a one-of, it's high cost, it has a lot of problems. Even when it goes off, it doesn't necessarily work all that well or all that regularly. So to me, this looks more like fun, meme-style card than particularly good. So up next here, let's talk about Mage's legendary spell, Luna's Pocket Galaxy, for 7 mana. And a lot of people are reacting very positively to this card. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm a little less hyped about it. The effect here reads, change the cost of minions in your deck to 1 mana. And that sounds pretty crazy at first glance. Like, whoa, that is the Druid Quest Jungle Giants, but it's in a single card with no condition. And you're like, wow, it's not quite as good because it's 1 mana instead of 0, of course, but pretty much the same sort of thing, getting this huge discount on your minions and theoretically being able to play minions very, very efficiently for the rest of the game. And, there's always going to be potential with that sort of card, right? You can play a 1 mana Archmage Antonitis and just go absolutely ham and get lots and lots of fireballs. You can play a 1 mana Malagos and go nuts with damage. These sorts of cards always do something cool. So I'm by no means saying this is a bad card. I think there could very easily be a deck built around Luna's Pocket Galaxy that finds some competitive success. But the problem for Luna's Pocket Galaxy to me really boils down to the fact that it's going to be pretty awkward to get this card to work. First off, of course, is the fact that it's a 7 mana play that does absolutely nothing the turn you play it. Remember, this is not affecting minions in your hand, so it's not like you're going to get some discount and have some giant swing turn on minions in your hand. It's going to take a while to draw those minions. Even if you combo it out with a specific card draw the same turn, it's going to be very, very hard to squeeze anything into a single turn. So it's basically a 7 mana pass that's an investment on the future. And frankly, if you're in a position in a game where you have 7 mana to play for free and you're hoping to swing the game later, you're probably in such a good position that by that point, the game has already sort of diverged in a path where you know who's going to win or somebody's in a really advantageous position already. And I don't know how much Luna's Pocket Galaxy helps you finish that plan or helps you follow up. kind of like our last card. It's a win more card in ways that doesn't necessarily help you win more. So that's a really big challenge for Luna's Pocket Galaxy. There's also just the consistency aspect of it. When are you drawing this? And how many minions are left in your deck? And specifically, are your important combo pieces left in your deck? If you're looking for that Malygos or Anthonitis sort of plan, are they already drawn? Does that mean it breaks your deck and breaks your entire game plan? And then do you run Baleful Bankers to help solve that problem, to put those back into your deck? And then how do you draw your Anthonitis again? There are all these awkward questions that start to have to be resolved when you start talking about Luna's Pocket Galaxy. So maybe it's not combo, maybe it's this minion-based deck, and you have a lot of heavy-hitting stuff. Just Ysseras and Lich Kings and big crazy minions. But then the question becomes, essentially, how does the early game of your deck look? Does that make any sense? Do you run a lot of control cards, and how many minions can you fit in? There are problems there. So you just end up in this spot, to me, where I don't really know who wants to run this. Like, yes, it has a positive effect. Yes, when it comes for free off of Primordial Glyph, for free, by that I mean not free for mana cost, but free for a spot in your deck list, you're going to be excited to cast it sometimes if you have a deck. But I don't think tempo decks want to run this. Certainly not burn decks want to run this. Combo decks might, but can you pull it off? And are there better ways to do it? And what that means is we have a card here that looks good on a surface level and has a very exciting effect. But just because it's coming so late in the game and it takes so much time to really pay off because it's the 7 mana initially and then you got to draw all these 1 mana cards, I don't know that it's going to have much impact when it actually hits the field. So I'm not trashing the card again. I do think that somebody's going to make this work in some kind of deck. I just don't think it's going to be dominant or a huge part of what Mage is trying to accomplish. I think there are some really difficult hurdles for this card to overcome for it to see lots of play, and that's why it's going to be a bit more limited in its utility than a lot of people are arguing. So now let's talk about Subject 9, a neutral minion here. It's a 5 mana 4/4 beast. And its battlecry reads, draw 5 different secrets from your deck. So, whoa, 5 mana 4/4, a little understated, of course, but potentially draws you up to 5 cards. That's kind of ridiculous for a 5 mana 4/4. But unfortunately, as is always the case, it's never quite that simple. It's not just to draw 5. They have to be secrets, and of course, they have to be different secrets. So right off the bat, I'm just going to say it's hard to run 5 different secrets in a deck. Hunters don't do that. Mages don't do that. Rogues don't even have that option. Paladins can and have in the past, but frankly, with Paladins, if you run that many secrets and you don't draw your Subject 9, your entire deck is just going to be broken. So your deck basically becomes this do I draw Subject 9 or not sort of plan, and that's a very, very hard thing to rely on. So that's not particularly a good path for me either. But that said, you don't actually have to draw 5 secrets for this thing to make sense. Maybe just drawing 2 or 3 is enough, because still a 5 mana 4/4 that draws you a few cards is a pretty solid play. Particularly in Hunter, where this has some beast synergies as well. That's intriguing. Now, we don't currently have many Hunter lists running secrets that aren't specifically Spell Hunter, and this does not fit in a Spell Hunter deck because it's a minion, but there's always mid-range hunters in the past that have run secrets just because the Spellstone is so good. You can put that package into the recruit stuff. You can put it into a mid-range set and still make it work. So I think there's some possibility for Subject 9 to see play. That said, again, lots of challenges for this card because frankly, secrets on average just aren't things we like to actually spend mana on in Hearthstone. Most of the times we've seen secrets be a huge success, it's because they've been put into play for free, particularly with Paladin, of course, in the old days of Secret Paladin with Mysterious Challenger, where it would just put all of your secrets into play for free. That was kind of the biggest secret deck. But even if we look towards Tempo Mage with like Kirin Mage, they don't really like paying for their secrets either. And then we've even got Arcane Keysmith, where you only sort of pay for your secret, and you don't like actually having to draw it and taking up that spot in your deck. Mad Scientist, of course, cheated secrets into play as well in the past. And rarely, if we ever played secrets, Hunter is the closest class that's really wanted to play secrets, and lately that's only because it empowers your Spellstone and you're setting up this really big swing turn on turn 5. But the problem with Subject 9 in that interaction is that you can't draw your secrets and then play them all and rely on a turn 5 Spellstone with Subject 9, because he's coming down on turn 5. Takes you another 4 mana to play multiple secrets that you've drawn. So basically you're looking at a turn 7 or maybe turn 6 with a coin to play your Spellstone at the earliest if everything lines up perfectly. And as we know in Hearthstone, of course, things don't ever line up perfectly. So that huge swing turn of having that Spellstone on turn 5 becomes less and less powerful as the game wears on, as your opponent finds more tools and resources and pressure to just push through that. So even in Hunter Subject 9, as we understand Secrets today, looks a little bit limited. Now, at the end of the day, the card is still fundamentally got some strengths. It's a reasonable body with a very good card draw effect. So there might be somebody down the line that wants to play this thing, but frankly, I think it's going to have a long gap before that's relevant, and I don't think any decks right now are going to want to do it. So Subject 9 to me, not fundamentally terrible, but a card that looks like it's going to take a while to get any action. So now let's talk about the new Warlock legendary minion, Dr. Morrigan. This is an 8-mana 5/5 with a death rattle that reads, swap this with a minion from your deck. And frankly, I don't think Dr. Morrigan is very good. First off, of course, that stat line is pretty weak for an 8-drop. It's not doing anything immediate or defensive, so that's really hard to find time to play unless you've already started to stabilize a game, just because it's a very passive, slow sort of maneuver on turn 8. So you need to get some real value out of this death rattle for it to make sense. And frankly, that sounds very difficult as well, because you're swapping this with a minion from your deck, which presumably is just some random minion. You can, of course, get Void Lords, which might feel kind of cool. It's almost like a possessed lackey sort of play, but obviously way worse than possessed lackey. So is it some other really high threat minion that you can cheat out? Maybe you go for the Malagos. That seems to be the theme of this expansion. Maybe it's a Lich King or Ysera or some other thing that you want to play. But then you're not really getting that much of a discount in the first place because you spent 8 mana here anyway. You kind of got a free 5/5, I guess. But the consistency issues are the biggest challenge there, because are you running other cheap minions in your deck? Are you only running giant minions, or are you also running Voidwalkers or Flame Imps or Hooked Reavers or whatever it is? Those are things you don't really want to swap here with Dr. Morrigan. You might say, well, Regis, that'd be okay if you swapped in a 4/4. Dr. Morrigan goes back in your deck, so presumably you get to play her again, and you have this infinite resource tool. And I'm like, well, okay, but you're not making much of a tempo play, and Warlock can already go long in games, so does she do this better than anybody else? I don't think so. I don't think this really fits that plan very well. There are stronger, faster, even more infinite kinds of plays to be made in Hearthstone, so I don't know why Dr. Morrigan would really work all that well. So what I end up here is a minion that's awkward, inconsistent, a deck building challenge in a way, but also just incredibly slow and inefficient for her cost. So to me, I don't really see how you use this card or who wants to use it or why you use it. It feels like a weak throwaway legendary for Warlock that Blizzard said, hey, this might have some fun applications here and there, but ultimately we don't want to give Warlock a really strong legendary right now because Warlock's in a pretty darn good place and has been for a while. And you know what? I'm fine with that. It's okay for this card to not be amazing. I hope you don't get it in your packs. That's always unfortunate, but I'm fine with a weaker power level for Warlock right now. So up next here, we have another Warlock card. This is Void Analyst, 2-mana 2/2 Demon. Death Rattle reads, give all demons in your hand +1/+1. So this looks like a bit of a zoo card, an early aggressive minion that plays well with other minions, which is what Zoo likes to do. But specifically, this operates more in a demon environment because it's buffing demons. It is a demon itself. It's a little bit understated for a 2-drop, so you really do have to rely on this Death Rattle for it to make sense. And I do think that Death Rattle will be pretty successful in Zoo decks. Typically, if you're able to play this on turn 2, you might have 4 or 5 minions in hand, and you get, 3, 4, 5 worth of buff stats total. That's a really big immediate impact, because those minions are there right now. You'll be able to play them soon. The downside, of course, is that they all have to be demons if you want that to work. So you have to run a really specific, narrow deck list for Void Analyst to roll that high, which means Zoo, as we understand today, wouldn't really work. There's been some demon buff-based Zoos in the past, but those ran spells in order to achieve that, so Void Analyst wouldn't synergize particularly there, even in wild format with some of those demon buff cards that are still available, like Blood Fury Potion, for instance. So a little bit awkward to use this card, and I think the narrow deck design element is what's ultimately going to hold this back. A lot of people have compared this to Prince Keleseth and said, hey, you'd rather run Keleseth. I think that's true. I think as long as Keleseth is in standard format, Void Analyst is going to have a lot of trouble. The reason Keleseth works so well in Warlock particularly is because Warlock's able to life tap into those Keleseth buff cards much faster than most classes are. So those Keleseth buffs keep coming faster and faster and are actually relevant much quicker than they are in a lot of classes. So the upside of Void Analyst, which buffs minions in your hand, is surpassed rather quickly. Just, you know, in 3 or 4 turns, a Keleseth buff deck will have achieved the same amount of buffs and put them into play just as quickly as, you know, would Void Analyst. So you're not sacrificing much, and of course Keleseth has much, much higher long-term upside and no limit on demons. The deck building element is relevant, but with all the 1-drops in Zoo, it really doesn't become a huge problem to run Keleseth in the first place, particularly because your hero power isn't bad either. So yes, not a good card in a Keleseth meta by any means. That said, if Keleseth goes away, which it will rotate sooner than Void Analyst, that's going to give Void Analyst an entire year to be a relevant 2-drop for a Zoo Warlock deck with things like Vulgar Homunculus. It might see some play then. It's certainly a fine card. I don't think it's definitive or amazing or, you know, it's going to be the thing that makes Zoo relevant, but it could be an important piece of the puzzle that replaces that Keleseth environment, replaces Keleseth in that next meta environment, essentially, to be the go-to 2-drop for Zoo. So a little bit of potential, just not an absolute standout card. So now let's talk about the Prismatic Lens here for Paladin, a 4-mana spell. And this is a pretty crazy effect. Draw a minion and a spell from your deck, and then swap their costs. So at a base level, this is a 4-mana draw 2, which frankly isn't that bad. We've seen that be successful with like Branching Paths. It's a little bit worse than something like Arcane Intellect, of course, but that's something you're willing to do in Hearthstone, spend 4 mana to draw a couple cards. But you got to consider the effect here and whether that's an upside or a downside, and specifically if you can build your deck in a way to make that really valuable. I think one of the best ways to use Prismatic Lens is to, for instance, not run a whole lot of spells in your deck. Maybe just a couple high-cost spells, things like Dino Size or Lay on Hands, perhaps, where you know they're going to have a higher cost total on average, so that when your Prismatic Lens hits, some of those really high-impact spells might get a reduced cost from a cheap minion, for instance. So you suddenly get a really valuable asset that's maybe only 1 or 2 or 3 mana instead of 8 mana. And that's a big discount on these big swingy spells. The challenge there, of course, is that you turned your Firefly, which was 1 mana, into an 8 mana minion, so you've got this like dead, stranded Firefly. So every time you gain a little bit in one direction, you lose in the other direction. But that said, still, if there's some really specific combo piece you're looking to tutor out, or some crazy minion you want to play super cheap, for instance, you could, I guess, put a Mechathune or a Malagos as the only minion in your deck with a bunch of secrets, I guess, and you'd suddenly have a 1-mana Malagos, right? If you could somehow do that, that's not going to be how this works, but it's possible. So, you know, the more specific and narrow you get in the deck building design challenge here for Prismatic Lens, the crazier sorts of things you can pull off. But is that ever going to work? Is that going to be competitive? I don't think so. I think more just a general use card cycle is how this would be utilized, and maybe with a few specific spells here and there for some swings, or maybe a few specific minions, but that's going to be a much harder direction. High cost minions and low cost spells, it's going to be harder to build a real deck around. Certainly Paladin has a lot of low cost spells, but you can't win a game with just playing low cost spells probably. So I think you got to go the other direction. But is it ever going to make sense? I don't know. There's a little bit of potential with a card like this. Paladin has other better card draw options on average, I'd say. So unless some deck really is able to utilize this successfully, I don't think this will see a whole lot of play. But it's not inherently bad. It has that hope, that potential to do something interesting somewhere down the line. So up next here we have the Meteorologist, a new Mage minion. It's a 6-mana 3/3, and the battle cry reads, for each card in your hand, deal 1 damage to a random enemy. So this is basically like a hand mage Avenging Wrath. We've seen Avenging Wrath for 6 mana for Paladin that deals 8 damage to the board, and that is a somewhat playable card, or at least it was in even Paladin, particularly because of its combination with Equality, though, is where it became really good. It became this great board clear option that could also do damage in a pinch. I do not think Meteorologist has the same application in Mage that Avenging Wrath had in Paladin. First off, there's no Equality in Mage, so this does not become that instant awesome board clear combination. Secondly, this has that requirement that you have to have a pretty big hand if you want this to actually be as good as Avenging Wrath. And that's not always going to be challenging for a big spell mage. They can easily have 6, 7, 8, 9 cards in hand without too much work or really thinking about it. It's not like they have to try to do that necessarily. So Meteorologist could very easily do, 5, 6, 7, 8 damage worth of pings if it's included in such a deck. The question, though, for Mage is, are you trying to do face damage with that? Because this does say random enemy, not just enemy minions. Are you trying to use it as a board clear? And then when you go down those two paths, you have to say, wait, doesn't Mage have better ways to do face damage? And doesn't Mage have better ways to do a board clear? And I don't think the flexibility of Meteorologist is worth sacrificing the consistency of those other options. If you're looking for damage, maybe you just run a Pyroblast. If you're looking for board clear, you just run a Flame Strike. And both of those are going to be better at what they're trying to do. So that's in a control environment. Now, with Meteorologist, you might say, well, you could run this in an aggressive deck because it does damage, but the problem there, of course, is that it's much harder for an aggressive deck to get a lot of cards. You could, for instance, run Alaneth to try to mitigate that, because a lot of aggressive decks do run Alaneth. But even then, you've got this 6 mana card in your hand that anytime you don't draw Alaneth is just a complete and utter waste of space. And aggressive decks that are all about burn and playing quickly just can't afford cards that are only situationally good and sit in your hand otherwise. Those are just way too hard to work. So Meteorologist to me just looks like an awkward tweener gap minion, essentially, that doesn't really do anything well, and nobody's actually going to want to run this. If it all lines up, it's a fine card, but rarely is that going to be better than the alternatives, and rarely is it really even going to line up all that well. So I don't think Meteorologist is going to see a lot of play. Now let's talk about the Omega Mind, a new card for Shaman, and this is another Omega card, of course, a 2-mana 2/3 this time around. The battle cry reads, if you have 10 mana crystals, your spells have lifesteal this turn. And I do like the cheaper Omega cards thus far, because I think they're a lot more flexible in what they do, because you can play them as minions super early desperately if you want to. Alternatively, of course, you can flex them into a turn very efficiently late in the game in that post 10 mana world. Because they're so cheap, you can play other things alongside them. So much like Priest's Omega card, Omega Mind looks pretty solid to me. And Shaman, of course, has lots of ways to do lots of damage with spells. Volcano and Lightning Storm come to mind first and foremost for Shaman, where you can use Omega Mind as this really big board clear setup that also heals you for a ton. And against an aggressive deck or just to stabilize late, that's exactly what Shaman needs. And some people will say, well, if you get to 10 mana, haven't you already beaten an aggressive deck? Sometimes, yes. Sometimes this would be unnecessary. Sometimes you've already stabilized the game at 10 mana. But frankly, a lot of the other time, you still have those like scary outs where that mage is trying to top deck that fireball, or the hunter's looking for some hero powers and a kill command, and you're just desperate to gain a little life. You can see that a lot in Shudderwalk Shaman with those healing rains. I mean, I don't know how many times a shaman, when I'm 5 damage off, has hit a healing rain perfectly and just shut me out of the game. Omega Mind serves as the same kind of alternative to that. It's also actually a battle cry, so I guess it theoretically connects with Shudderwalk too, although it depends on how much mana you have, and if you're already playing Shudderwalks at 1 mana, you probably already won the game, so that's likely not super relevant. But regardless, Omega Mind just does something cool for control shamans. It's a nice card that sets up a lot of survivability. It's a bit like Halaziel the Ascended we saw in the past, but cheaper and much, much easier to play, I think. So that flexibility, that ability to restore a chance to win a game, or at least preserve a chance to win a game with lots of life gain, those big swing turns, is really, really good. So I think Omega Mind will find a deck eventually. So up next here, let's talk about Galvanizer. New neutral mech, 2 mana 1/2. Battlecry reads, reduce the cost of mechs in your hand by 1. And for Galvanizer, clearly, I think this is designed for a more aggressive mech style of play, where you're reducing cost of your early game minions, you're playing them out pretty quickly, and hopefully overwhelming your opponent. But unfortunately for Galvanizer, I don't think it's going to work quite as well as we saw with Mech Warper in the past for Goblins versus Gnomes. That was a persistent effect that had a much higher chance to snowball out of control. This is a little bit limited by what's in your hand, and the cost reduction is limited as well to what's in your hand, so it can't last persistently. There's some upside there to Mech Warper, some downside, but the real problem for me with Galvanizer is the stat line. It's not as good as a 2/3. Doesn't apply as much pressure. It doesn't trade as well into an early board. So using your like turn 2, for instance, to play this guy isn't going to feel nearly as good, because it's not going to contest nearly as much. So to me, it looks weaker in an aggro deck. By no means terrible. You could still play it. It's still fine on turn 4, turn 5 even, just to help cheat some bigger things out. And then beyond that, there might be a little bit of potential with a card like this with something like Mechathune, I guess, technically. I still think Mechathune's going to be darn near impossible regardless of how much you discount it. There are just too many other problems. But Galvanizer can reduce the cost of Mechathune for potentially some crazy combo stuff. So keep that in mind. So cute little guy. It's totally fine. I probably made it sound worse than it is. But I do think it's got some problems that are going to make it less than ideal. It's really the same problem we saw for Fireplume Harbinger with Elementals. Galvanizer might be a little better because Elemental decks are more mid-rangey than aggressive. So this probably fits the aggressive playstyle better than Fireplume Harbinger because those cost discounts don't matter as much when you get to turn 6, turn 7, turn 8 as they do on turn 2, turn 3, turn 4 when you're looking to overwhelm your opponent. So Galvanizer looks better to me than Fireplume Harbinger, which everybody thought was going to be a great card, by the way, and ended up being very merely average. And that means it's fine. It'll see a little bit of play. So now let's talk about Seaforium Bomber, new neutral 5-mana 5/5. Battlecry reads, shuffle a bomb into your opponent's deck. When drawn, it explodes for 5 damage. So this looks very reminiscent to the old card Iron Juggernaut for Warrior, which was a 6-mana 6/5, I believe, but shuffled a 10 damage bomb into your opponent's deck. Now that never really saw any play. The problem, of course, with sacrificing some stats on board for a potential future damage piece is just not very good because damage doesn't matter until it matters, and then you sacrificed a little bit on the way to that damage, and how soon are they going to draw that card, you never really know. Seaforium Bomber, I think, makes a little bit less of a sacrifice when it comes to stats and an onboard play. 5-mana 5/5 is fine. But the same problem with the bomb exists. It's how quickly can your opponent draw it. And would I rather have done something more proactive, more immediate, more relevant right now, as opposed to setting up for a potential kill in the future with these bombs? So I don't think this is, a card that fits every deck by any means. It's just awkward, even aggressive decks. It's too inconsistent to rely on that damage, as it's not, it does not say deal 5 damage to your opponent. If it said that, aggressive decks would love this. It says 1 out of 20 times deal 5 damage to your opponent, and that's just not enough. There are faster, more damage relevant cards. Now that said, I'm not giving up hope on this card because I bet there's some weird combo deck with Shadow Steps and Augmented Elic and all kinds of Lab Recruiter shenanigans where you can just put like 20 bombs in your opponent's deck. And if that's the rate at which you can do it, if you can get 5, 10, 15 bombs in there, suddenly Seaforium Bomber might make a lot more sense. So not a completely hopeless card by any means, particularly because the stat line isn't bad. 5-mana 5/5 is fine. So it wouldn't be a huge sacrifice if you have a combo built around enacting this exactly. What that means for me with Seaforium Bomber is it's totally okay. Won't see a whole lot of play, but keep an eye out for that one deck that somehow makes this thing work in a magical way. And then up next here we have the EMP Operative, a new 5-mana 3/3 tech card with a battle cry that reads, destroy a mech. And I think it's cool that we're getting a tech card for mechs immediately as opposed to like an expansion or 2 later. Unfortunately, I don't think EMP Operative is very good at all. And the reason for that is that this card has a fundamental flaw in my mind, and that's that if it ever becomes a popular tech card to answer a really popular, mech deck, then the way Magnetize works, it gives the mech operator the control on how to play. So they can, for instance, go up into one big minion if there are no silences or no EMP Operative in the meta, and just go all in on one magnetic mech. Otherwise, they can play it wide and go small with their mechs and go perhaps even more aggressively with cheap mechs and play a faster, more aggressive style. And EMP Operative is really only going to be good when your opponent stacks all their mechs together into one magnetic giant guy, because you'll be able to destroy all of them at once. If a deck goes wider with multiple mechs, EMP Operative's not going to be great because the return on your investment here is going to be so slim. You're going to kill, 1, 3, or 4 mana mech maybe. Occasionally you'll get a bigger one, I guess. But you're running a tech card in order to achieve that, which is a downside in and of itself. It's got terrible stats, so it's not much of a swing. It's kind of that big game hunter stat line right here, but for mechs instead of 7 attack minions. So you're making sacrifices to run this thing, and then it's only going to occasionally pay off. And of course, tech cards can be a surprise, so if it doesn't become popular, it's the kind of thing that'll pop in from time to time to answer one specific matchup. That's fine. That's a possibility. It's a playable card. I just don't think it's ever going to be a consistent part of the meta, because I think it's unlikely that there's more than, 1 or 2 mech decks at most. First off, so I don't think they're going to be everywhere on the ladder. Secondly, like I said, the mech controller has influence over how this card could operate, and particularly if mech decks are just more aggressively oriented in the first place, if they're faster and more about wide boards than they are tall mechs, EMP Operative is just going to be too slow, because killing one mech of 4 or 5 on the board is just going to still leave you dead, and it won't be a relevant tech card. So another card that looks okay, it's got some playability, it just won't be very popular. And that wraps it up for my detailed reviews. Now let's jump into some quick reviews rating each of these cards from 1 to 5 stars. The Stormbringer is a 2-star card. Luna's Pocket Galaxy is a 3-star card. Subject 9 is a 2-star card. Dr. Morrigan is a 1-star card. Void Analyst is a 3-star card. Prismatic Lens is a 2-star card. Meteorologist is a 2-star card. Omega Mind is a 4-star card. Galvanizer is a 3-star card. Seaforium Bomber is a 3-star card. EMP Operative is a 2-star card. And there you go, that wraps it up for part 11 of my Boomsday card review. Tell me what you think. I'm always curious to hear what you have to say. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.